Welcome everybody. It is 7:30 Central Standard Time, and it is time for us to go live, reacting to every single Alex O'Connor video on the internet. There's a lot of videos. How you guys doing today? Let me know in the comments below. How are you guys doing today in the form of an emoji or maybe your favorite word? You know, I don't think you guys know this, but I used to actually run a different YouTube channel. And at the end of every video, we would do a word of the day. And it would be just some kind of word that we'd look up in the dictionary. A lot of the time, we had no idea what the word meant. But it was just a fun way to end every single video. So if you got a word for the day, a word of the day, put it in the comments below. Guys, I am so glad that you guys are here. Today, we are reacting to, it's more of a podcast than anything else. I don't really know how to describe it, but what I realized just now is that the the video is not actually a video. It's like stagnant video. At least from what I saw, it's just stagnant. So I don't know if there's technical issues or something, but we're going to roll with it. It's on the internet. It's technically a video. So we're watching it. We're here. We are glued in, keyed in. So, but where are we at? Where are we at in terms of watching every video? You know, that's a good question. So currently we are at 88 videos in. That's just from my previous, watching on my own and stuff like that. But so far, I think we've watched, what is it, like 5 or 6 videos together? So that's pretty good. And in terms of, I should get the hours in, but I think that'd be pretty fun. And then I've been collecting all of the different comments here as well. So these are the different comments that we've been able to put on the videos. So yeah, so I'm pretty excited about all of that. But today we are watching a video by Alex O'Connor that is about why he is an atheist. And so he went to Durham and he gave a discussion on why he is an atheist. And so that's the main thing that we're going to be discussing. Shalom from Oklahoma. Welcome. Shalom. Welcome to the stream. Yeah, where are you guys at? We got someone from Oklahoma. I'm in Nebraska, so got my Nebraska stuff, repping the Cornhuskers, if you guys know what that is. But yeah, welcome Cornhusker, and welcome Sooner State. I guess we're rivals in terms of football and some other sports, but you're welcome here. So but yeah, as I was saying earlier, we're pretty far. We're getting there. We had a pretty successful stream. Let me know. Give me a thumbs up if you were here last time. Last week was the first time doing this live, and so yeah, give me a thumbs up in the chat if you were here. Let's go. But yeah, so a little bit more about just what this video is going to be. It's basically just him describing why he's a Christian or not a Christian. And so it's titled Why I Am Not a Christian, and it's just the audio. So that'll be pretty interesting. It's at the Durham University is where he gave this speech. So I'm pretty excited to get into this, but we'll get into some more stuff as well. Riley, welcome. CT. Is that? I don't know the annotation super well. CT. What state is that? Connecticut. Okay. Nice. East Coast. Yeah. Yeah, I'm so bad at those those annotations, but I love it. But yeah, I'm excited to get into all of this and get your guys' thoughts on this. It'll be interesting to hear kind of why he's an atheist. I mean, that's kind of what he's known for, you know what I mean? But I think a lot of the arguments and a lot of the things that I've heard from previous videos. I'll probably be hearing some of those things like non-resistant non-believer, arguments in terms of, other religions, the problem of evil, some of the different things that he mentioned in terms of like the genocide in the Bible and those kind of things might be there. I know he grew up Catholic, so he'll probably share a little bit about those kind of things. So, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure what all is going to be here, so I'm excited to dive in with all of you guys. So, yeah, let me know in the comments below, what do you think is going to be in this video? What topics is he going to cover and things of that sort? But without further ado, I say let's get into it. Why I am not a Christian. Audio, Cosmic Accepted at Durham University. Here we go. I see. So it was technical issue. Relatable.
It's been a great experience to be looking around. I spend most of my time sat in front of a camera speaking to an empty room, so it's always nice to be reminded that there are in fact people on the other side. That is what I do, in case you don't know anything about me. I make videos for the free consumption of anybody who wishes to lend me their ear. It's an interesting job to have, a wonderful job to have. I get along very well with my boss. So the fact that I am my boss. It's an interesting job description as well. I find that the majority of people you'll find speaking about philosophical atheism or secularism, campaigning, that kind of thing, they tend to have another job principally. It's not what they do full time. So they'll be a biologist like Richard Dawkins, or a physicist like Lawrence Krauss. They might be a journalist or a lecturer or just an office worker who spends their free time quite valiantly, in my opinion, campaigning for atheism and secularism. I, on the other hand, this is all I do. So I think that I'm at least somewhat justified in, when asked about my occupation, calling myself a professional atheist, which is a quite fantastic job description. Makes for some interesting conversation. I'll often be introduced to a new person or meet some family who I haven't seen in a while, and they'll shake my hand and they'll ask my name, and then I'll notice a big cross hanging around my neck, and then they'll ask me, so what do you do? I have to admit, I'll tend to vouch for instead saying that I'm a YouTuber or something, rather than my slightly more exciting job title.
Alex is quite the speaker. That's pretty amazing. He just works a crowd super well. It's pretty impressive, even at this age. Like so many years ago, he just has natural talent. It's impressive. It's pretty cool.
Now, you all know why I'm here. Of course, you've seen the title of the talk. I'm not a Christian anymore. I used to be a Christian, quite piously so. In fact, I remember. Many people don't know this about me. I used to, in fact, be an altar boy. I wore the robes and I swung the incense. It was an interesting experience, especially looking back on it now. By some people's definition, in fact, I still am a Christian. I am yet to send my official letter of resignation, as it were, to the bishop, which I think, as far as I know, is still the official way to leave the Catholic Church. You have to actually write in. Having said that, I think if any bishop was wondering about my prospects of rejoining the Catholic Church and wondering what I'm getting up to now, a short 5-minute YouTube search should answer that question. I don't think the letter of resignation would be entirely necessary. Now, I do want to make a disclaimer, which I do whenever I speak about these matters, this subject. It's a disclaimer which I think will be somewhat redundant here, but perhaps not as much as people think. I make no attempt at sensitive diplomacy or moral apology. When I speak about my experiences with the Christian faith, I do so candidly and without fear of censorship. Now, I have to say, I'm not expecting anybody here to jump up with a placard or a megaphone and try to shout me down. However, we can't forget that this isn't the only form of censorship that exists. There is another, probably more egregious form of censorship, in fact, and that censorship is self-imposed. It's born out of sympathy, perhaps empathy. I think we all partake in it every now and again in certain social situations. Now, I don't want it to be said or thought that I'm unfamiliar with the feeling that the concrete beneath your feet is beginning to crack, that the unsolicited dropping of the heart that can occur when you start to believe that just maybe everything that you've ever been taught, everything that you have ever thought about the world is in fact wrong. I would never wish to try to argue that this can ever be a pleasurable experience, at least initially, but my experience with this and my experience in losing my faith and experiencing the repercussions doesn't just not stop me from speaking my mind about the Christian church. It makes me do so with more fervency and urgency, because I know how it feels to be in the process of leaving. I know how it feels to be on the other side, and I know how it feels to be where I am now, and I can tell you categorically that I feel much more satisfied philosophically, morally, and socially with where I am now, which is why I speak. Now,
Yeah, no, I really appreciate him saying that, because I know I'm sure many of the people that watch me, are still Christian, and I have a lot of friends that, are still Christian, and a lot of people, in my life that are still believers. And so I think sometimes I will, like he said, censor myself and try to hold back in a way of being courteous and not saying something a little too obtuse. And I also think there's wisdom in that too. Like, I don't think that's like a bad thing. Like, I but in terms of like these formal things, sometimes you say stuff and you're like, oh boy, should I say that? And then you're like, well, no, this is not just for the benefit of me or people that I know, but it's actually for the benefit of a lot of other people. And so, while it might be not something I would say to a loved one in person, it might be something I'd say on the internet, because it is something that is beneficial for a larger audience, for a larger group of people, especially people who are wanting to know things and dig into things. And so, there's this sort of me in person that's going to be very different than someone who is here online, speaking about these issues, because I'm not going to go up to someone and give them reasons to doubt their faith if it looks like they're having a great life. I think they should stay Christian in that sense, and they should, love God. And who's to say that I'm right? I might be wrong. And so there's just so much to it when it comes to that sort of human dynamic. And I like to think of what I do as putting the human back into religion. Instead of having religion be the thing that sort of like drives your life, instead of the stories being the things that drive you, right? You can be the arbiter. You can be the person in charge of your life, rather than having these religious stories and this dogma be the thing that leads your life. And so putting the human back in religion, I think, is really what I'm all about. I'm about expressing religion in a healthy way that is beautiful and that's beneficial for humans. That's not about control or for the group dynamic. Like, I don't give a crap about any of that stuff. But I do give a crap about people, and I love people, and I want them to feel loved and cared for in life. And so when we're approaching these conversations, I very much so relate to him, where it's like, I'm going to speak what seems to be true, what seems to be accurate. But most of all, I'm going to do my best to put, the humans back in religion, the humanity back into religion. So, yeah, I relate to a lot of what he was saying there.
As well as not expecting anybody here to be too contentious in terms of the free speech issue, I also would assume that the majority of people who come to these kinds of events tend to be quite agreeable philosophically with me, which is always a little bit disappointing, I have to say. If I don't have at least a few eyebrows raised by the end of any talk, I feel I've done somewhat of a disservice.
Did you know that 95% of girls
It's worth noting that if you do find anything within a talk, within what I have to say, slightly objectionable or questionable, or perhaps you're even offended, I want you to know that that's fine. The only thing to bear in mind is that these facts do not constitute a point. And if you do in fact have a point of worth to make, then there'll be the chance at the end to raise your hand. If you want to raise your hand while I'm talking, feel free. I'd happily ask any questions, and you can challenge me, you can question me, you can even offend me if you wish, and the only thing that I ask is that you afford me the same respect and allow me to challenge you. Still, having made this disclaimer, inevitably the question is raised. I'm here not really to talk about one thing. I'm here more to talk about two. I'll explain that in a moment. Effectively, the distinction comes in talking existentially about religion and Christianity, and the second thing to talk about is the moral implications. Now, when I'm talking about moral implications, then there is required some kind of explanation, some kind of justification for what I'm saying. And again, I do have experience with this, and it isn't something that I haven't thought about. When I was quite young, my family and I had just moved into our second home in an unfamiliar civil parish just 2 miles southeast of Oxford city centre. It was around Easter time, and being new to the area, we decided to take the short walk to the church that stood on the corner of our street to introduce ourselves to the faithful of our new community. So we went in, and being Easter, it was quite busy. We managed to find a space at the back that was relatively empty. We counted ourselves quite lucky. We quickly realised, however, the reason that position was so empty was because we'd managed to place ourselves in front of a feebling, trembling choir of a less than angelic standard, and their accompanying church organ, which I think may have actually been older than the singers themselves. Despite this, however, we weren't the sole occupants of that particular pew, because sat rather unassumingly beside me was a nameless elderly lady who, by virtue of her position and of her lack of company, I can only assume was considerably lonely, old-aged, and probably quite hard of hearing as well. Now, as I was looking around, taking in my surroundings, as the priest was still in the vestry, donning himself with robes, and his altar boys with robes that I myself would later go on to don in that same church, this woman began to budge towards me. Now, had it been anybody else moving in my direction, I probably would have done everything that I could to avoid engaging and reciprocating the advance, as would stay true with my then rather childishly unsociable nature. However, there was something warm about this particular lady, and so before I knew it, I was greeting her advance with a welcoming smile and an amiable nod. And before I had the chance to draw the breath of a greeting, she grasped my boyish hands, and she said with the utmost sincerity, "I wish you and your family a very, very happy Easter." Now, the frail voice and honest character that came attached to these simple words have presumably long since perished, and yet they stay with me. It's not an unusual thing to hear around the observance of Lent, even from strangers, this kind of thing, but usually such sort of festive intercourse comes across as positively feigned and just dripping with indifference. But that's why it was so touching that my family and I had instead been gifted with something that was so pure and untainted by social obligation, a genuine good wish from a genuine individual. This woman was quite clearly in a state of emotional solitude and physical deterioration that would drive most people, I think, to a quite understandable state of despair and loneliness and perhaps even nihilism. And yet something was preserving her and her kind nature. But I don't think it takes much thought, and it certainly didn't take me much thought, even at my young age, to identify her piety, her faith, as at least a major contributing factor. So how dare I attempt to take this kind of thing away from somebody? Somebody like this. Every time I think of the implications of my videos and my writing and my speaking, I think about this lady. For every email I receive and every story I hear of people who have repossessed their spiritual autonomy and live freer lives because of it, there will be people like her whose faith may very well have been the only thing she felt that she had. I want you to know it's not a trivial concern. A lot of people just brush this kind of thing off and say, well, you know, Facts don't care about your feelings, I've heard it said before.
Sorry, guys. That was so loud.
And it is something that does take a lot of thought. Still, the conclusion that I've reached, and I hope to commit to it too, is that when considering the most important questions, the big questions, the things that really matter, there will never be a proposition made or an answer suggested that can satisfy the emotional requirements of every person. It simply can never happen. And even if such an impossibly accommodating proposition were to emerge, it would say precisely nothing about the factual accuracy of the statement, only the contentment of the number of people who are content with that statement. And I think when we are discussing the most important questions, which I consider this to be one of them, I think it would do us well to put such considerations aside. I work according to the principle that attempts made to evaluate supernatural claims need no more of a warrant than the innate desire that exists within every rational creature to pursue truth wherever it leads. It needs no more of a warrant than the criticism of politics, or of art, or music, or poetry. And I don't just say what I have to say despite the offence that it may cause. I say what I have to say because of the offence that it might cause. John Stuart Mill, on Liberty, proposed a thought experiment whereby there is a society, I'm sure many of you have studied, there is a society you can picture, all of whom, except one person, believe in a proposition. They agree on something, except for a single individual. Mill said that we have as much right to silence that individual as we do to silence all of mankind. Even if I did offend more people than I didn't, I wouldn't just carry on talking despite that. I would do it perhaps even because of it. This is the disclaimer that I always wish to make.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I would say, I mean, that makes sense. I think it's good to rattle things up, to sort of be rebellious and sort of rattle people's assumptions, notions, preconceived notions. I think that's very healthy. I think that's a good thing. But I also think it is good to consider people's sort of reactions and existential crises that might happen from having these sort of conversations. But at the same time, I think, like I said before, there's a distinction between, okay, are you talking, what's the context in which you're talking about this, right? Are you talking about it in the context of like a public sphere where you're trying to just present the facts, present things that have been tested and seem to be the most accurate and most true? Is that the context you're presenting this? Or are you at, a church and you're trying to, convert everyone away from the church? Like, that seems a little kind of ridiculous to me and absurd. So context, in my opinion, does matter a lot. And so when you're in a context where it seems to be the right place to share about this, and someone might be like, oh, well, you shouldn't because of such and such reason, I would agree with him here. Like, it's okay to rattle things up. And if you share something with me that's going to rattle me, well, I mean, this is the other thing. We think that people are just so weak too. Like, that assumes that people are very weak and that they can't sort of deal with things. I think we should share things as much as well as we can with love and charity. We should be kind to people. But when we're talking about things and facts and maybe things people attach to their identities, we should also realize that people are pretty strong. Like, generally, people are, fairly strong. And this sort of assumes that people are just like on the verge of like, going off the deep end. And while I would hate that to ever be the case, and I will do as much as I can to avoid, using hurtful language in that way, I will speak the truth unapologetically. And if that means, someone is offended, it just means someone's offended. You know what I mean? So Yeah, no, I get what he's saying here, and I would I would agree. I think context does matter a ton in these conversations. So, and he displayed that when he talked about the the elderly woman. That's not the context to pull out the problem people for. Definitely not. But yeah.
I won't be silenced by my own sympathy. But I also want people to know that I do know how it feels, and I am sympathetic. However, like I say, it's because of that that I'm so urgent in the message that I have to share. And if you doubt that, if you don't believe me, then you can test it. You can tell me. You can tell the people I work with. You can say to us. You can say that we can't criticize a religion. You can say. You can tell me that I can't caricature a prophet. You can tell me that I can't disrespect an honest man's faith. And then you can watch me. Now, moving on from that aside, that disclaimer, I want to actually explain this distinction that I made a moment ago, that I'm talking about two things. The reason for this is because, frankly, to ask the question why I'm not a Christian, which is the title of the talk, in case you didn't know, I don't think it's up anywhere here, I think is a bit of a silly question. And that's no offense to the title of the event. I actually proposed it myself in light of Bertrand Russell's collection of essays, which I suggest you all should read. Why I'm not a Christian, that is. It is a silly question. And I suppose the best way of explaining this is to ask you all a question. If you wouldn't mind, could you please raise your hand if you regularly play golf? We have one. Fantastic. That's much better.
It is.
Now, what I really want to direct my questioning to everybody else.
See, I hear this kind of line of logic a lot of the time, and I think I would like kind of agree, but I also disagree in the sense that the reason why saying, why are you not a Christian, right? The reason why that's an important thing to sort of talk about and discuss is because we live in a culture where there's a lot of Christians. It's also because a lot of people who are atheists were former Christians, and so with that comes this idea of sort of like a anti-testimony. I don't know, but just your story, like what is your story? How did you get to where you are? And that I think is what matters most. Like, sure, the idea of like not believing in Christianity, you could probably find a ton of people who grew up in cultures outside of the Christian sphere, and that would be kind of a nonsense question, like the same thing with like, are you a golfer or are you not a golfer, as the example he's about to give. I would agree with that. Like, that's kind of a ridiculous thing. But say you were really into golfing and now you're no longer a golfer. Oh, that's an interesting story. What happened? Oh, I got an injury, or, oh, I realized it was just taking over my life and I had other dreams, other aspirations. That's an interesting story. And I think that in a sense is what I'm talking about. It brings humanity, brings the human condition, the human experience back into the forefront. And so that's why I think it does matter to talk about these things. Maybe he'll say that, but I do often hear that, and I'm like, yes, and there's more to hear. There's more to the story here that I think needs to definitely be addressed. It says video not playing. Yeah, I addressed this at the beginning. This is just audio only. You can kind of see here it says why I'm not a Christian audio. So yeah, it's one of those kind of videos where there's technical difficulties or whatever. So, but we're here, we're watching every single video. So we are not skipping, not even for a lack of video. We are doing the whole thing. So if you're geared in, if you're in for the long haul, give me a heart, give me a thumbs up. And yeah, I appreciate that you guys are here, but yeah, I do recognize that the video is not playing. So thank you for that. But yeah, let's hear the rest of this thing.
My question would be, excluding this gentleman, why don't you play golf?
It turns out that there are
Why are you not a golfer? just think for a moment about how silly a question that is, and about what you would say in response if somebody were to ask you that. It's not a case of why you're not a golfer. It's why should you be a golfer? The arguments are there. It could be fun. You might not be convinced by that. It's healthy. It's good for you. You might not be convinced by that. It's not a case of arguments against golf. It's a case of arguments for golf, and you deciding whether or not they convince you to actually give it a go and play it regularly. That is probably how you'd answer the question. Somebody asks you, why don't you play golf? You say, well, why should I? And that's why in my Twitter bio, if you follow me on Twitter, which I hope you will do or are planning on doing, you'll see in my bio that I specified that I'm a non-golfer. And that's purely to make a point, to show people just how silly the label of atheism is. I have made a video in the past talking about why I think people should adopt the label of atheism, but that ultimately is rather, it seems odd to say, but the reason why I advocate for people to call themselves atheists is because I think that will eventually lead to the word dropping out of usage altogether. It sounds counterintuitive, but I have made a video on it. If you don't believe me, then listen to the argument. But this is the thing. This is the thing about asking the question. This is what I'm talking about. It's not going to be a case of me necessarily telling you why I'm not a Christian. It's more considering arguments in favour of Christianity and considering why they're unconvincing.
And I get that. I get it because it sort of pushes the burden of proof off of the atheist. And I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, like I don't really care what you believe, but I'm mostly concerned about fundamentalism and people sort of, pushing their beliefs onto other people. That's my main concern. And so, if you are all about, sharing love and being as Christianity says, being a light in the world, I'm all about that too. I just don't think that Jesus rose from the dead. And that's where we differ on facts. We don't necessarily differ on purpose and meaning in life. So, I kind of get where he's coming from. It pushes the burden of proof off of the person, the atheist. I still think the atheist, especially if they're trying to sort of show why they maybe switch what they believe, they don't have to, but if you're into it, especially if you are maybe formally into apologetics, it's worth sharing about, and it's worth kind of digging into these things. So I get why people do this, and I kind of ascribe to it, sort of. I don't know. I don't see a huge reason as to sort of have this sort of mindset of, oh, atheism is just like anti whatever, and so we shouldn't use the term. The term exists, and maybe we can rat it out. I don't know. I don't even know if we should or not, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
This is analogous to belief in God entirely, in fact. You'll often be met with the claim, if you call yourself an atheist, somebody will say, well, are you certain there is no God? You say, well, of course not. That would be preposterous. Some people do, of course, but the majority of people say, no, that would be preposterous. And so you're met with this accusation of agnosticism. You're not a real atheist, you're an agnostic. Well, I can turn this round on its head. When I debated probably the most devout.
Sorry, I was just listening to something earlier today, and there was a pastor. He's in kind of the progressive church. Anyway, he calls himself a agnostic Christian, which is very interesting. You know how people say, I'm an agnostic atheist. I'm atheist in that I kind of live as if there is no God, but at the same time, I don't know that for sure. So I'm agnostic atheist, right? Well, he considers himself an agnostic Christian. He's like, I don't know for certain whether, the Christianity is true, whether Jesus rose from the dead. I trust that. I have faith in that. And so I'm an agnostic Christian. So it's kind of controversial, but, maybe that's how people can start adopting things. I don't know. It's definitely an interesting thought for sure. Let me know. Do any of you ascribe to that? Are any of you agnostic Christians? Maybe not.
Christian I've met personally, Mr. Frank Turek, who is a very devout man, I can tell you. This is a man who once was speaking to a college audience, I suppose similar to an audience like this, perhaps more sizable and probably a slightly younger demographic even. And he was asked by a student, Mr. Church, if God told you to kill your children, would you do it? And Mr. Church, a man who has children, to a room full of other children, said, yes, I would. So this is a pious man. And yet when I asked him personally, I said, well, are you sure that God exists? Do you know it for a fact? He said, well, no, of course I can't know it 100% sure. Well, I'm sorry, but I could throw the same argument in your face. You're not a real Christian, you're an agnostic. But that would be preposterous to say, because saying that you're a Christian doesn't imply that you're 100% sure. It's a completely separate claim. It's a distinction that I've seen made before, and that I make all the time, between agnosticism and atheism. And it works also in the context of this situation. To say that you don't know is one thing. To say that you don't believe is another. I simply say that I don't know, therefore I don't believe. And that seems to me to be the logical position to take. Someone like Mr. Churek will say, well, I don't know either, and yet I do believe. Now, of course, there are people who say, I do know there is no God, or I do know there is a God, and these people have adopted for themselves a rather sizable burden of proof, and that has to be accepted. If you are somebody who claims actively that there is no God, and like after having made this distinction, I then do go on to make arguments that I think do positively act against Christianity, we have to accept that there is a burden of proof in that. But to simply say that you don't believe it, to simply say that you're not a Christian, to simply say that you don't believe in a God, requires no kind of philosophical justification other than a rejection of arguments that have been put to you. A wonderful analogy for this, if you ever find yourself needing to explain this to people, if you're anything like me, that is, there is an analogy that I heard from Matt Dillahunty, who once gave the example of a marble jar, or something of that sort. Imagine you and I are walking down a road and we see a marble jar. Now, we have no idea how many marbles are in this jar. We have no way of knowing. But we're interested. We want to find out. And I decide to say, well, after looking at it for a few seconds, I say, I think there's an even number of marbles in this jar. Would you believe me? If you are a rational person, you wouldn't. How on earth could I possibly know that? I'm just making, I'm just saying this, I pulled it out of thin air. Why on earth would I be saying that? You say, no. No, I don't believe you. I don't think there's an even number of marbles in this jar. So I'd say, so you think there's an odd number? No, not saying that either. Disbelief in one thing is not the same as the positive belief in the opposite. To say that you don't think there's an even number of marbles in the jar is not the same as saying you think there's an odd number. In the same respect, to say that you're not a Christian, to say that you're not a believer or an atheist, is not to say that you believe actively that Christianity is false or immoral, or to believe actively that that there is no God. This is a distinction that's very important to make. Now, to make this distinction, the two reasons, the reason that I've explained this here is because the two reasons that I'm speaking on, the two topics that I'm speaking on, I should say, are not necessarily two reasons not to believe in the Christian God, but two reasons to believe in the Christian God. Because, like I say, when we're rejecting a claim, we're really talking about somebody else's argument. So there are two reasons to believe in God and religion. Two reasons only, generally speaking. The first is a belief in the truth of a doctrine. And the second is a utility argument. So that is to say, the first is to say, well, I'm not entirely sure about the morality of this whole ordeal. I don't know if it was entirely moral to flood the earth, or to burn Sodom and Gomorrah, or to turn Lot's wife into a pillar of salt, resulting in him having to drunkenly impregnate his own daughters. I'm not sure about all of that. However, it's true. So I have to believe it. I have to accept it. This is a matter of fact. I'm a religious person. I believe there's a God. Therefore, I'm a Christian, or I'm whatever religion you choose. The second reason is practically the polar opposite of this. It's to say, well, I'm not entirely sure about the truth of this whole thing. I don't know if the Virgin really did conceive. I don't know if God really does exist. But without that belief, where would I get my morality? Where would I get my hope for the afterlife? Where would I get my social structure from? These are the two reasons. Now, for a lot of people, it's a mixture of the two. They'll say that I believe it's true and I believe it's useful.
Here's the brain science behind
try to at least somewhat convince you that both of these are equally delusory. So, when talking about the...
It's interesting that he says the utility side is delusory, like a delusion, because that's a subjective thing, because that's just based on, do you perceive this as useful for your life? And I think it is. Like it's we can see that in so many people's lives. It affects people in so many positive ways and changes people's lives in so many positive ways. I've even seen like my faith in Christianity, it changed my life for the better. And so to say that that's a delusion is to ignore the most clear evidence that you can have, which is evidence from your own experience, your own life. So I would outright probably disagree with that. I think utility is probably the most clear evidence. I think there's other sort of evidences, and I talk about this fairly often. There's things that you can argue in favor of, especially for a God existing. I don't know necessarily about the Christian God. I think there's things to be said. Like there's the argument of the resurrection. There's prophecy, we can look at that stuff. And I think at the end of the day, those things you're going to be convinced by based on what you already are inclined toward, because those evidences sort of push you a little bit further in the direction of what you already are inclined toward. Whereas, like actual like scientific evidence, maybe if the Shroud of Turin is like legitimate, that would be something that's like, oh, that's contemporary physical evidence. That's going to be like, I can't deny that. Or if someone had like an actual like real experience with Jesus, like appearing to them like physically right in front of them, sort of like a Thomas sort of experience, that was pretty strong evidence right there. And I would say that's something definitely to listen to. I got a few comments here. You think it's like, even if atheist is right, but still have faith in God, they will still die with no afterlife. But if they did have faith, then they go to heaven, like 50-50. Also, I said that weirdly. Okay, so let me see if I understand what you're saying. Let me know if I'm misunderstanding you, and you can maybe clarify. So you said it's if an atheist is right but still have faith in God, they will still die with. So okay, so I don't think this is kind of like Pascal's wager, right? The idea of like, okay, there's a lot at stake if you don't believe in God. And so you might as well just believe in God in order to sort of avoid hell, right? Because it's better to maybe put out like a false faith and, trust that rather than the consequence of denying God. And I think God would just see right through that, like that. You're not going to fool God with like a fake faith. Now, maybe it's not a fake faith. Maybe it's just like, I don't think that, this whole thing is true, but I'm going to maybe trust in it anyway because maybe it is true. Maybe I just have wrong information and I'd rather that. Maybe God would see that as real faith. I don't know. But I think at the end of the day, what God wants is authentic people, people who are authentically following him. He wants a relationship with people. How can you have a relationship with someone who's constantly sort of doubting your existence or constantly doubting your trustworthiness? Like these are very essential things for a relationship. And so that's kind of what I mean. When I was talking earlier about utility, which might have been what you're referring to, I think it is important to consider utility, right? Because if something has changed your life, that's evidence of it being true, right? Maybe it's not sufficient evidence, but it is evidence in favor of that. And if it is something that is sort of giving you life and giving you a joy in life, something that is like truly changing you for the positive, then pursue that. Like that's a beautiful thing. Like I want you to pursue that. I don't want to sort of like tell you that you have to believe this, you have to live this way because this is what's objectively true. Like I think that's kind of a false notion there. So in terms of like Pascal's wager, I would disagree with Pascal's wager because it's all about sort of like hedging your bets. Like, oh, I don't want to go to hell, so I'm going to just believe in God. I don't think that's how God views salvation. That's not how God, at least, portrays himself, especially in the New Testament through Jesus. He wants authentic, real followers of him. And so to kind of hedge your bets in that way, I think is it's faulty in that sense. More so to avoid human problems, because even atheism is like, I don't believe most is at peace, but again, Christians. Okay, yeah. No, yeah, I would agree with that too. So in that sense, I would agree with you. The less like Pascal's wager, but the more kind of like, this is useful for my life. This is what gives me life. You know, I wake up every single morning. I spend some time in the Word. I spend some time in prayer, and it just gives me this sort of rest in life. And maybe that's evidence of God too. You know, like as a believer, I looked at that and I saw that as true evidence of God. And if that's the reason you're a Christian, I'm 100% for it. Like I'm not here to bash you, but if that's also the reason why you're Hindu, or if that's the reason why you're Muslim, or if that's the reason why you're any sort of faith, I want to encourage you in that. I want to say, yes, pursue that. I think that's a worthwhile thing to pursue. And when people, you know, start having sort of exclusivism to their faith, that's where I see the problem. So that's the thing I'm pushing back against mostly. But yeah, no, I would agree with that whole concept there. So yeah, thank you for clarifying with that. Definitely. For anyone who's just tuning in, this is a interesting video. It's just a picture because I guess the video, cut out or whatever. So it's why I'm not a Christian, according to Alex O'Connor here, and it's just the audio because I guess the visuals weren't working. So for anyone who's tuning in, like, what's wrong with the video? That's what's going on. It's just there was a technical issue, but we're here. We're watching every single video, and if you want to be a part of this journey, well, welcome. Welcome to Truth and Tradition. Welcome to this crazy dream of mine. I am so glad that you are here and that you guys get to be a part of this. So yeah, let's continue with the video.
Second distinction, because the first distinction about arguments in terms of the existential nature of God, whether God actually exists, these tend to be much more broad. They tend to be things like a cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, which I will happily speak on if I have time. If I don't, then and you want to hear me speak on it, you can ask the question, or perhaps I can speak to you afterwards. Particularly things like the fine-tuning argument, which once seemed so irrefutable. Christopher Hitchens, in fact, peace be upon him, once said that the fine-tuning argument was the best argument in favor of religion, and it actually made him stop and think. And I mean, if that's not a stamp of approval, I don't know what is. But I want to speak first about this moral idea, this utility argument, because this is where my experience really comes in. When I was young, like I say, I was quite pious. I remember coming home from a school trip on the back of a coach, and whilst all of the other kids were playing music, doing dares, whatever it is that kids do, I wasn't very good at being a kid. I was sat with my rosary, counting my beads, saying my...
He just said he's so bad. He wasn't good at being a kid. I just want to say his very first video is him doing a guitar solo behind his back. If that's not doing life as a kid fairly well, then I don't know what is. Also, he was a skater and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not buying it, Alex. I'm not buying it. Nah. He's being humble here.
Hail Mary. Now, I don't think I have to spell out to you exactly the kind of abuse that I received for this. And of course, I didn't care. I was doing it for God. I believed that this was good for me. Only now I look back and just absolutely lament how much time I must have wasted doing this kind of stuff. But like I say, I was religious. But one of the reasons that I began to stop believing, one of the reasons that I began to really be interested in philosophical arguments was because I realized, at a relatively young age actually, I have no idea why I believe this. I have absolutely no clue. It wasn't a case of me necessarily reading arguments against the existence of God, against the existence of Christianity, which was my religion, and Catholicism, which was my denomination. It was more just a realization that I didn't know any arguments in favor of it. The reason that I was a Christian was because I'd been brought up as such, but because of the moral side, because I thought I needed some hope for the afterlife. I thought that I needed structure in my life, and I thought that when I was sat on the back of the coach and bored and lonely, I could turn to God. This was why I believed, and this is why I think it's so important to tackle this stuff. And this is also why, when you watch debates, it's insufferable to me. You'll watch a debate, and people will always move from the existential debate to the political debate. Somebody will say, I believe in God because everything needs a cause. And the other person will say, well,
Forget hiring a VA. I install.
but if that was true, then it would be evil. It would be horrible. We'd be subjects. It would be terrible. Well, I'm sorry, that has nothing to do with it. These are completely separate arguments. And if we're going to make these arguments, we have to make sure we separate them. So, of course, talking about the moral implications of God doesn't necessarily have any implications on whether or not that God exists. But it's a little bit different when you talk about specific gods, when you talk about a God like the Christian God, because of course this God claims to be moral, and the religion claims to be the sole revealed truth. Therefore, if you can say something about its morality, its moral teachings, then I think you can say something about the existence of the religion itself. So, when considering the morality of the Bible, every single thing, in fact scientifically too, I'd say, everything that's in the Bible is one of two things. It's either wrong or it's unimpressive. What I mean by that is that it's either, a claim made is either going to just be flat out wrong and disproven. Morally, in terms of what we now accept to be almost unanimously immoral being presented as a virtue in the Bible. Or it's something which is true and is a good point, but could have come from anywhere and is entirely unimpressive. If we want to talk about things that are wrong, which I think is the most perhaps interesting thing to speak about first, things that are just flat out wrong, and so also, by my definition, unimpressive, you need look no further than the Genesis story. Now, before I even begin to speak on this, I don't wish to argue that every Christian believes in the literal truth of Genesis. That would be absurd. And I think that most Christians, in fact, don't even give these creationists the time of day. However, you still have some explaining to do. If you wish to believe that there was a God who decided to create a species and humanity, and did so not just by doing it, not just by creating things as they are, but by creating a circus of cosmology, of cosmic and biological evolution that finally ended up with us, then you're welcome. You can believe that. However, if you're going to claim that this God particularly cares about humanity, then you have some explaining to do. The best way that I have to illustrate why I feel this way is to think about the emergence of Homo sapiens. Christianity, at its core, believes that Homo sapiens is the most important species on Earth. And some sects of Christianity and some other religions believe that certain tribes of a certain species, of a certain human, of a certain ape, is the most important. If you're going to make this claim, then you have to explain, when did God begin caring? When did God begin caring about humans? I would pay you all the compliment of assuming that you accept the evidence in favor of evolutionary biology. If you don't, then please raise your hand at the end of this discussion. I'll be happy to speak to you about it. The thing about the emergence of Homo sapiens through evolution is there's a common misconception about this idea of the first human. There's no such thing as a first human. Richard Dawkins once said in a discussion, I think on an unrelated topic actually, that you don't go to sleep one night middle-aged and wake up the next day elderly. You don't go to sleep youthful and wake up middle-aged. It doesn't work like that. It's a slow, gradual progression. It's the same thing with the evolution of humans. There was no first human. It's not like some ancestral ape gave birth to a brand new species. It was indistinguishable. Okay, the first human was indistinguishable from its mother and from its child. No difference whatsoever. And so the emergence was slow and steady. And eventually, the only reason that we even have categories in the history of evolution is that that's an entirely constructed enterprise. It's an entirely constructed thing. That there's no objective separation in the evolution of a species. And in fact, when Homo sapiens did emerge, they weren't the only species of human. That's another common misconception, that Homo sapiens is a synonym for human. It's not. In fact, for quite a long time, Homo sapiens were living side by side with other human species like the Neanderthals and the Homo erectus. Now, before we'd wiped these other species off the map, even if they didn't exist, and we were just talking about the evolution of humans as a linear thing, even ignoring the extra branches, there's still a lot of explaining that needs to be done, because if God is particularly waiting for this species of human to come along and he cares about every single human, then at what point did he say, okay, I care about this person? Because presumably he didn't care so much about the apes that constituted our ancestors. He didn't care about them. He certainly didn't care about the first microorganisms that started life on Earth. And so at what point along this timeline did God finally say, okay, this point, this human, this...
I want to cut him off there because I think that's maybe taking things a little too far. He basically said, okay, and yes, the Bible presents, and a lot of religions present God as favoring humans over other, species. And that's fair. Like, I kind of get it. I think it sort of makes sense given just kind of evolutionary process. But to then say that, like, God doesn't care about other animals at all, like, that isn't accurate. Like, I mean, we see that other animals, live and thrive, and there's lots of evidence of animal not just suffering but pleasure as well in the wilderness. And so I don't know if there's sort of this favoritism that's presented in religion. Maybe that's because the people writing religious texts are humans. And so maybe it's a representation of the authors and not necessarily the inspiration part of scripture. There's a lot of different things that you could say about this. And then when he mentioned fine tuning, if anything, is evidence that God cares about all sorts of animals and all sorts of species, right? And so to say that he doesn't care about these other species and he only cares about humans, right? That's kind of missing the point of, well, why do we exist? Well, it's because all of these sort of traits in physics in the physical world just so happen to be exactly the way they are. The expansion rate of the universe and the acceleration of that expansion rate just so happen to be just the right speed so that particles can actually exist, and those material can then combine and create humans. Like, there's so many things that had to be in place in order for us to exist, or any species at all to exist. And so fine-tuning in and of itself is evidence of some sort of care, So I would probably push back on that a little bit. I get the sentiment of it, and I think I would agree with basically the sentiment, which is there is a sense of egotism to a lot of faith traditions. And that, I think, is what he's getting at. But when it comes to the whole notion of, like, God doesn't care about any other species at all, like, I would push back on that. There's clear evidence, especially with fine-tuning arguments, the teleological arguments, those are very strong in favor of God caring about other species. So, I mostly agree with you, but I would push back just a little bit when it comes to that.
This is the first human born. There was no such thing. And so you either have to admit that God was a little more flexible, or you have to admit that it's simply not the case. It's simply not true. There was no first human. There is no way to explain why a God who cares particularly about humans would choose this method to bring them about on Earth. Many people have said that the discovery of evolution works in favor of the existence of the God, and perhaps it does, but only an impersonal first mover, not a personal God, because a personal God wouldn't do this. Perhaps there is an explanation for it. Perhaps something has just slipped my mind, and I'd love to hear it. But to me, it seems an almost impossibly reconcilable contradiction. And that's not the only thing that the book of Genesis gets wrong, of course, because it's too easy almost to talk about. Of course, Noah's Ark did not occur. Of course, if it did, then you'd have to explain why the Chinese were still writing during the time when they were supposedly all dying from the flood. We don't even need to cover that material. But it's not just the big claims that can, if you really want to push it, be taken as allegorical that are the problem. It's the smaller things. Things such as the Bible stating that the moon emits its own light. Things such as Genesis saying that the sun is not a star, that it's separate. Things such as the Bible saying that there is a firmament above the earth.
If you don't understand
These things are not explained by allegory. They're not.
Sorry about the ads, guys. I'm trying to catch up so they don't just blast your ears, but apologize about that.
Part of a bigger picture. They're not part of a huge story that can be disproven. They are just parts on the side. Now, the fact that they're parts on the side has caused a lot of people to say, well, it doesn't matter that much then. Who cares? Well, I'm sorry. This is either a perfect, inspired book, or it is not. It's one or the other. You don't get to pick. Now, of course, there are people who do.
I majorly disagree with that. The whole idea of it has to be, and also, what do you mean by inspired? Because when he's referencing inspiration, he makes it seem like it's the same thing as inerrancy. And inspiration is not the same idea as inerrancy, right? Inerrancy is this concept that sort of came about in the Enlightenment, and it's a way of describing inspiration, but it's not the definition of inspiration. Inspiration just means that God inspired the text. That doesn't mean that it can't have errors. That doesn't mean that the human authors who were writing it couldn't have made mistakes. It just means that overall the message and the things that are being portrayed in it are from God. He's the one that inspired it. And so to say that these are the same things, that the Bible's entirely scientifically accurate, those arguments, people have to make them because there are people who believe the Bible believe the Bible is 100% scientifically accurate. Those people are out there. Answers in Genesis is very adamant about that, but at the end of the day, you can be a Christian and not believe in inerrancy. And I think that's probably the avenue you should take. Just because there's blatant things that don't quite add up, but you can still be a Christian and believe in inspiration. And inspiration, for the most part, in terms of most of Christian history, inspiration has not been defined as inerrancy. It's been defined as in terms of teaching. Is it useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness? That's in 2 Timothy. Teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness. Those are the attributes of being God-breathed, right? And so that's what it means to be inspired by God. It doesn't have to be entirely 100% accurate. So, yeah, and honestly, this is an older video, so Alex probably has refined some of these things. This video's 7 years old, so clearly, he hasn't refined these minute details. But with that in mind, this is something a Christian would easily push back against and say, no, we're not talking about inerrancy, we're talking about inspiration, and that's what matters even more, if anything. So,
and most Christians do pick and choose. But there is a problem with that too, and I'll get to that in a moment when I talk about Jesus, because there are, firstly, a few more things that are wrong. For instance, another just interesting odd bit is that the Bible, many people might not know this, the Bible miscalculates pi at one point. I'm sure I can see some nodding heads. It's quite a fascinating thing. Now, there have been attempts to explain this away. Most of them are completely unsatisfactory. Again, especially considering that this is a divinely inspired book. So not only does the Bible not contain calculus, or something that would really help us, Kepler's laws of planetary motion, something that could not have come from anywhere else. It actually gets things wrong things wrong, and things that are relatively simple. The Bible describes the construction of a circular object, in effect, and it gives the measurement. It says precisely, because God is very specific in the Old Testament, as you'll know if you've flicked through his pages. He gives the dimensions. He says, I want this diameter and I want this radius. Well, if you put those, if you work out the ratio of those calculations, of course the ratio between the diameter of a circle and its radius and diameter is pi. It's 3.14, 1592. It goes on, of course. If you take the numbers from the Bible, it equals 3.0 on the dot. It's wrong. So God has actually ordered people to construct an impossible structure. This structure cannot exist. It can't exist. Nonetheless, they built it anyway. This is not the kind of thing that you would expect from a book that has been revealed by the supreme source of knowledge of the universe. Now, of course, some people simply say that the Old Testament doesn't matter because there was a sequel. In fact, it can be quite condescending if you think about it, the fact that Christians call the Old Testament, which is still the supreme and holy book of the Jews, the Old Testament. Seems to imply perhaps that it's not as important, but I'm afraid it is. And of course, one interesting thing to think about is the same.
Okay, I wanted to look into the pi thing that he was talking about because I was like, I haven't heard that before. So it's in, what is this? 1 Kings 7:23. I'll pull it up here real quick. So 1 Kings 7:23 says, right here, then he made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around. Okay, so basically, if you were to sort of figure out from the parameter here, what is the it explains it here. The seemingly simple statement about dimensions, 1 Kings 7:23, prompts the question, if the diameter of the sea is 10 cubits, why does the circumference only measure 30 cubits? This would suggest pi equals 3, whereas modern geometry calculates pi as 3.14159265 and so on, so on, so on. Okay, so that kind of makes sense. Again, I mean, it's an interesting fact. It's an interesting thing to point to. Doesn't mean that the Bible's not inspired. I mean, there's nuance here. There's more nuanced ways of understanding this. So again, that's kind of what I'd point to. Is like, what do you mean by inspiration? The Jordan Peterson. What do you mean by this? How do you define this word? Those are very important things to distinguish. And so that's, I mean, as someone who is wanting to play devil's advocate, that's what I'd say. Sure, you can point out these little scientific miscomings here and there, but overall, this is not going to do anything in terms of convincing someone that something's wrong. What will convince someone is pointing out maybe some errors in terms of prophecies that weren't correct, or pointing out different areas in the Bible where there's moral quandaries, where God doesn't seem to be working out the same sort of morality that he's presenting in other parts of Scripture, or I think the resurrection, refuting some of the arguments of the resurrection. That's kind of what is a bigger deal. But maybe this is a big deal to some people. So I don't want to say it doesn't matter. It does matter in some sense, but I mean, there's simply just a way of redefining what you mean by inspiration, and redefining it in the sense of like not inerrancy is more in alignment with historical church, not the modern Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment church.
People who are saying that they'll give a pass on a lot of the Old Testament stuff. It was meant for the Jews at the time and the Israelites. It's not binding today. These are the same people who want to see the Ten Commandments plastered outside of courthouses, even though they come from the same place. And if you want to talk about the Ten Commandments, that's another thing that I can certainly speak on. Now, the problem with saying that the Old Testament simply doesn't matter.
This video right here
for a start. For instance, referring to people such as Noah as historical characters, which again, if you are going to write off as any logical person would the story of Noah and his ridiculous ark, you have to explain. Jesus didn't refer to him in a story or a parable, he referred to him as a historical character. How do you explain that? Either you take the approach that it's all true, and you embarrass yourself in front of any audience which is even slightly scientifically literate, or you have to admit some form of critique and say that the Bible isn't all it's cracked up to be. Jesus also, of course, said that he came to fulfill the Old Testament prophecy and the Old Testament laws. And when he was asked about proof for people who hadn't heard the message of Jesus, he said, they have Moses and the prophets. He thought the Old Testament was good enough for Christians. So why don't most Christians? That's the question that I would ask. Now, as for the New Testament, this is where you tend to find most of the focus on the moral argument. They'll say, well, without Christianity, where would we have the morality that originated with it? Well, like I say, I'll make the distinction again. Everything that was said by Jesus and his followers were either wrong or unimpressive. Even the best things you can think of. For instance, the golden rule is quite a good one. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of course, not even mentioning the fact that this could be immediately improved on by simply saying, why not just do unto others as they would do unto them, as they would have done unto themselves, not how you would have done unto you. Perhaps you have different preferences. You don't like the same things. You don't want to be treated in the same way. Maybe socially they're not as interested in attention as you are. Maybe it's the opposite. We can already improve on this teaching, but even if we thought it was the most incredible teaching, which a lot of Christians parade it to be, it appeared in the Analects of Confucius earlier than Jesus. And if I want to get that morality from Confucius, I don't have to believe that he was also the Son of God in the package. He doesn't require that of me. Whereas with Jesus, and the letters of Paul, if you read them, you have to take it all together. St. Paul said, in fact, that if the miracles weren't true, if Jesus wasn't born of a virgin, if he didn't rise again, specifically, if Jesus was not resurrected, then the entire thing falls to pieces. This is from St. Paul himself. You take it all, or you take none of it. Now, of course, this isn't to say that most Christians subscribe to this kind of logic. And a lot of them say, well, despite that, I'm still just going to choose the paths that apply to me, and I'm still going to pick and choose, and I'm still going to take certain moral teachings, because they do exist. Fine. If you're going to do that, that might actually be good for you. In fact, as a historical example, you can look to Thomas Jefferson, who literally took a Bible, a New Testament, and he physically cut out references to the supernatural and the divine and miracles, leaving him with just the moral teachings of Jesus. And he called it the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth, or something of the sort. You can do that. That's fine. But if you're going to do that, there's simply no need to call yourself a Christian. Okay? I'm sure, having been brought up a Christian, that many of the moral teachings that I hold come from the Christian faith. I have no doubt about that. My only contention is that I could have got it elsewhere. And since I've done more reading and more research, I now have a morality that's based still partly in Christian scripture, but also some parts of Islam, would you believe it, are in fact moral. They are there, believe it. Also, morality can be found in all sorts of other religions, as well as political ideologies. Every single ideology that exists has at least some redeeming factor. Anyway, any religion, any ideology, any political position, you can find something to say that it's got a good principle. Communism, it's all just about equality. You can employ the kind of sophistry all the time, but the fact of the matter is, you don't have to call yourself a Christian to accept something like the Golden Rule. You don't have to call yourself a communist to believe in equality for the same reason. It simply doesn't make any sense. Now, the problem with discussing the moral argument is that it has sort of two dimensions. It's not just a case of saying that you need Christianity to teach you about what's moral. You need to be a Christian to be a moral person. A lot of people will say that morality doesn't actually make sense at all unless it has an objective basis. To say something is good or evil is just an opinion unless it has some kind of objective basis. Now, as it happens, I agree with this statement. I simply just don't see anything wrong with morality being based upon subjectivity. Okay, we can all come to conclusions about morality without the need for an objective basis. And in fact, having an objective basis can be even more dangerous than having a subjective one, such as examples in Mr. Frank Turek saying that he would kill his children. Where else would you derive such sinister morality from? Where else could you possibly interpret such a statement, that it's okay to kill your children? Where could you get that from? Of course, Abraham didn't kill his child, but that's besides the point. He would have done, and the moral of the story, if there was a moral at all, and I use that term lightly, is that you should be willing to do so. This is not moral. This is not moral, and if you're going to claim that this is not only just an influence on your morality, but the basis for your morality, then again, you have some explaining to do.
Yeah, so there he's critiquing divine command as a moral basis, right? So, and he has several videos, talking about this idea of divine command being problematic as your basis for morality. I don't think it's necessarily bad for morality as long as it, correlates to the human intuitions that we often use in order to show that morality has some sort of actual basis to it. If it doesn't correlate to human sort of intuitions, then I think there's a problem, right? And that's where we have these sort of critiques, especially in the Bible when it comes to slavery, when it comes to genocide. Those are the kinds of things that we often see being critiqued about the Bible. And so, but I think there's so much more to the Bible too. That's something I'm not a fan of, is how often, atheism kind of online is always like, oh, the Bible's pro-slavery, oh, the Bible's this. It's like, well, it's also very pro a lot of beautiful things, right? It proposes the golden rule, like that's in other sort of faiths and things of that sort too. But something unique is loving your enemies, right? And praying for those who persecute you. That's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it's something that is unique to Christianity. It's unique to Jesus, right? So this whole kind of idea of, like morality, if it's like objective in accordance with a divine command, that doesn't mean it's automatically bad, but it does sort of come into question when it bumps up against human intuition. Like when you're being commanded, like Abraham was, to kill his son Isaac. That's kind of problematic, and God does stop it, right? And the Christian will say, God provided a goat, and so or a lamb, depending on your tradition, if you're Muslim or Christian, and that's fair. Like you can definitely say that, but as someone who's outside the faith, you can see why we would look at that and be like, I mean, you can say that, but from my point of view, this also looks pretty problematic. Like God's commanding someone to kill their own son. That seems a little problematic. And so I think what needs to happen is this sort of like, let's meet each other where we're at, like I can understand your explanations, but I hope you can understand why I'm hesitant to say, like, to just write that off and say, oh, there's this explanation. It's fine. And, I'm hesitant to do that because I'm like, this seems problematic. It goes against our intuitions. And so a morality that, like he's proposing here, that's subjective, but is based on our human intuitions, right? The evolutionary process that kind of favors survival, right? And the ability to pass on your genes, right? Are you fit for your environment? This is where sort of morality starts to come about. And this idea of yay and boo when it comes to different sort of moral preferences, right? That's what it means for morality to sort of emerge and then for it to develop through time, especially when we sort of develop different societies. That's what he's proposing here. I would assume that's what he proposes in several of his other videos. And it's something that I would probably subscribe to too. It's definitely something I want to look into more. I looked into it a lot, especially like in Mere Christianity, where C.S. Lewis breaks down kind of the moral argument in one of the best ways possible. If you haven't read Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, 100% recommend it. Such a great book. So many really interesting things he brings up there. But this idea of like morality needs to be subjective for it to be good. I don't know about that, but also does it need to be objective in order to be useful at all? Like, can murder technically be considered good if, morality is subjective? In a sense, sort of, right? But it's only as good as, like, it's sort of like saying that someone who comes to work and is never showers and is constantly dirty and is has terrible hygiene, right? That would be something that's sort of like, I would prefer you not to do that, and most people would prefer you not to do that. And living in a society where we have to sort of give in to what most people's moral intuitions are, that would make sense. Like, this is a preference that we all sort of share, and it's a preference that we should propagate because that's what's going to create the most pleasure for the most people. If you have a utilitarian sort of view on morality and ethics. So there's so much here. He's more of an emotivist now, where he believes that morality is just an emotional expression, right? It's, you are expressing an emotion, and that's what morality is at its basis, which is an interesting thought, something I've definitely been considering lately. Yeah, let me know below in the comments, like, what is your ethics? What's your basis of ethics? Are you a utilitarian? I think that's kind of what most people are, at least at first, when they kind of dig into this sort of content. But it's definitely an interesting subject, and for him to say that objective morality is just like ultimately going to lead you to something wrong, like, I would disagree with that. It depends on what is objectively holding it all together. Sam Harris, he believes in a secular objective morality that's basically just based on well-being at the very bottom of it, that we're all chasing after well-being. And I would disagree. I don't think that is objective. I think at the end of the day, there's still an opinion. And if life had sort of altered in a different way, if evolution had worked out in a slightly different way, then we wouldn't have those sort of moral preferences. And so it's not objective. But to each his own. It's definitely an interesting conversation. But yeah, let me know in comments what is your moral ethical system.
An interesting thought experiment to propose to people who do believe that their morality is based in the Christian faith is to say something preposterous. Say, for instance, would you, if God told you to...
Hi, I'm Andy Levian.
...gun and shoot up a primary school? Now, if they say yes, at least they're consistent. But they've shown just how dangerous a belief in objective morality can be. If, as I'm almost certain the vast majority, maybe not Mr. Chirek, would say, if they say no, I wouldn't do that, then all they've done is proved that their morality is not based in...
I also want to say that's not objective morality, right? Because this is a morality that is subjective to God, right? It's not objective to the universe and the construct of the universe. Now, we define God in that other sort of sense, that he's the fundamental thing, but at the end of the day, it's still subjective to God's preferences, and so it would make it not objective morality.
The gods, but rather vice versa. Their gods are predicated on their own moral subjectivity. And even if you're going to claim that morality has to have an objective basis, there are multiple to choose from. There are many gods that you can choose from. And the only way that you can choose which has the best morality is with a subjective analysis. Morality exists subjectively, in my view. Now, there have been actually secular attempts to show that morality is objective. Most recently, probably, and most notably, I'd say, by Sam Harris, whose work seems to be somewhat rooted in some of the philosophy of Bertrand Russell, about linking morality to well-being, which I don't have too much of a quarrel with it, other than a simply semantic one. I think that the statement that morality is defined by well-being is true, but subjectively. I think that it is true to say that everybody's morality is based on well-being, but I think that's a subjective assumption. That's the only quarrel I have. But to say that religion, or God, or Christianity in particular, is the objective basis for your morality is not only immoral, but it's also illogical. And that's one of the main reasons, in fact, that I'm not a Christian. But also within the morality of the Bible, of course, you don't just have things which are unimpressive, you have things which are positively immoral, particularly in the Old Testament. But as we've already seen, you can't just discount the Old Testament, especially if you're going to take something like the Ten Commandments and still live by those principles. I recently reviewed a book by an Oxford professor called Alistair McGrath and his wife Joanna McGrath, entitled The Dawkins Delusion. No prizes for guessing what it's about.
We just reviewed that one
rebut the God delusion. And
just a few videos ago.
This is just an example of the kind of cognitive dissonance that is apparent in the view that Christianity should be the basis of morality. He says that Christianity is good for the world and moral, and we should all believe it because, among other things, it abolished slavery and racism. Now, this is an interesting claim. Of course, it is true that Martin Luther King was a Christian. It is true that a lot of the arguments being made in 19th century America were religiously motivated, and in England even earlier. No quarrel with that. But all you're saying...
Oh, I guess it just kind of ends there. Okay. Well, that's the that's the first video. Interesting. It just kind of cuts off there. Wow, there was a lot there. Definitely so many things. I wish we got a little bit more about kind of his personal story, if I'm being honest, because I feel like he kind of sticks to a lot of the argumentative and the intellectual side, which I love. I think it's really cool. But it would have been nice to kind of see him dig into a little bit more of his kind of like personal story. And then I also think some of the arguments he was making, they're not as refined as kind of his more modern sort of perspective of argumentation. So in terms of like quality of video, well, there was no video, so maybe not the highest quality. But yeah, in terms of, overall like experience, I think it was pretty decent. Again, it would have been cool to see kind of more of his personality, more of his personal experience, more humanity. I think in that video would have been a little bit nicer. But now it's time to figure out the comment. What comment are we going to be leaving today, guys? Are we going to be nice? Are we going to be funny? Are we going to comment about his perspective? What do we got? What are we thinking? What kind of comment do we want to leave? Do we want to leave a topical comment? Do we want to critique him in some way, or do we want to just sort of leave a comment in some manner of what was on topic with what he said? So I will bring up a poll here. What type of comment shall we leave? And I'll say funny. We'll have to be creative with that one. All right, so I got funny, kind, topical, and argumentative, and the poll is out there. So go ahead, fill it in. What kind of comment shall we leave for Mr. Alex O'Connor in this on this video? It is a bit on his like story and things of that sort. Also, let's see if we can get inspired. Let's get inspired. What have other people said? Alex is basically a polite Hitchens. That's fair. I mean, Hitchens was a huge influence on him, so I'm not going to read that one. Okay. Trust when I tell you that I understand the gravity of the claim I'm about to make, but Alex O'Connor is the divine protege of Christopher Hitchens. What a time to be alive. I'm not seeing any that are like sticking out to me. What have you guys put in the poll? Okay, so most of you guys want to be kind. At least you put a picture there so I can still see your face. Very nice. Yeah, I mean the cool thing about this video was just how kind or not kind, but how honest he was. He kind of just laid things out there. So I definitely appreciated that. So if we're going the kind route, I'm thinking something along the lines of like, oh man, I just appreciate just how honest you were. A funny one. Okay, we got another vote in. Someone wants to leave a funny comment. Any ideas? Any ideas? Yeah, I mean, we could probably say something about the fact that the video is frozen. I was tempted to. The video is frozen, so I was tempted to let it go. I don't know, something like that. It's hard to be funny on the spot. You know, the stand-up comedians, mad respect for those kind of people. Mad respect for them, for sure. All right, I'm thinking that's where the vote's going to be. So I'm going to get to choose. I'm going to break the tie. And I think I will say something along the lines of just appreciating how honest he was in this video. Because it was really cool to kind of see that side of him where he's like considering, what other people's thoughts and experiences might be when talking about these issues, because that is something that I don't think a lot of people recognize when they just kind of watch this content. Like there's a lot to consider when talking about God and faith. Yeah, he probably couldn't afford an IT guy at the time. Yeah, that's fair. I think it was actually the college that was filming it, and so the disclaimer at the beginning I think was kind of saying that the college had somehow the video had gotten corrupted or missing or something along the lines, or maybe there was an issue with the recording itself. So, but yeah, if he had his own IT guy that he could bring with him, then it probably wouldn't be as much of an issue. But I think I'm just going to say something along the lines of like just appreciating his honesty. Um, Boom. Yeah, I appreciate the honesty to say that you are unapologetically speaking out truth and recognizing the weight of the topic. Censorship is real, so I love that you are open about it. Dude, how do you spell honesty? That's embarrassing. That's it. There we go. Boom. And I'm gonna keep track of all of these. So, what is this video 88? I still have to fill in all the other ones, but this will be for later case. All right, I think I'll do maybe 1 or 2 more videos just because that one was kind of long. Definitely long-winded. How we doing, guys? Oh, I just realized that you are only looking at me. So, but yeah, how we doing? How we doing? Thumbs up. Everyone doing good? Definitely a longer video. Definitely a longer one. So, yeah, the videos get longer as we progress. So, I've been listening to kind of the longer ones on my own, as you can see here. Just because they're pretty long, but they're good. They're really, really good stuff. All right, what is the next one here? Next up, we have atheist evangelism, only on Fox News. Here we go.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and I want to remind you of something that I posted on social media recently. I'll be in Croatia next week for a free event with Lloyd Evans. The information is in the description. Come along if you can. Now, in the meantime, and in the spirit of Christmas, you may have seen a recent...
Lloyd Evans is a guy that speaks out about JWs. He's a former JW, so a Jehovah's Witness. So it's pretty cool. Lloyd Evans does a lot of stuff when it talks about like... kind of helping people leaving that community, because it can be a pretty rough environment for a lot of people. If you don't know much about Jehovah's Witness, definitely look into it. Like the Watchtower is a pretty rough environment. And so when it comes to faith, I'm okay with people tearing that one down because it causes a lot of harm for a lot of people. So yeah, definitely a great guy. I love that he's doing that.
Discussion on Fox News between Nick Fish of American Atheists and Frank Turek regarding a series of billboards that American atheists have decided to display across the United States during the holiday season, effectively criticizing the religious aspect of Christmas and reminding Americans that atheists are a thing. Now, for transparency's sake, I really don't personally care about the billboards. I don't think they're necessary. I can see why they might come across as a bit proselytizy, and I'm not here to sing their praises. Still, I think that Dr. Turek's attempted criticisms presented here are even more lackluster, and in fact, the most serious problem I have with the discussion comes from something the moderator says. I thought it would be worth taking a look at.
Atheist billboards now up in several cities, sparking controversy at Christmas time, telling people to skip church because Christmas is just fake news. Hello and welcome to A Spirited Debate. I'm Lauren Green. Well, the billboards feature the image of the nativity scene and are focused in areas where there are large Christian populations. Are the atheists evangelizing? Here to debate are Nick Fish, National Program Director for the American Atheists, and Dr. Frank Turek, author of I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. Welcome to you both.
Good to be with you.
Hey, Lauren.
Okay, Nick, I want to start with you first because it seems that you are essentially evangelizing. You're trying to convert people to what you believe. I mean, like, why else would you put up those billboards?
Well, so the main reason to put up the billboard is to spark a conversation. And if you want to call that evangelizing, sure. But we want to get our foot in the door. We want to spark a debate. We want to have a spirited debate like we are right now. And we want to have that in communities where people just aren't thinking about that enough, where they're not talking about it, where atheist voices aren't being heard, where the assumption is that everybody is the same.
And here's a point of irony, actually. If Christians are so upset that atheists are being so loud and so prolific during the Christmas period, then the single best thing that they could do is simply ignore it. By being offended and by making a big deal out of the situation, look where we are. The banners that started the argument are now being displayed on Fox News. Seems like a win for the American atheists to me.
But why take the image of the nativity? You don't think that would offend people?
Well, so the issue isn't being offended. The issue is, again, getting our foot in the door and getting people talking about it. And so the only way to do that sometimes is to be provocative, to raise an eyebrow.
Now here, I very much appreciate Mr. Fish's honesty in recognizing the obviously provocative nature of the banners. The whole point of the campaign is, after all, to raise eyebrows, like he said, and gain attention from those who disagree. My own take in response to people who are offended would be to say that yes, this campaign certainly could have been undertaken in a more sensitive manner, but then that would defeat the object. They're provocative by necessity. Only by taking action such as this can the atheist voice be heard at all at Christmas time. If you're angry and upset that American atheists needed to be so upfront and potentially offensive with their banners, then maybe you should be trying to convince more Christians to respond to more diplomatic attempts at conversation, which they routinely neglect to do. If they were more willing, and if America was more accommodating of atheists in general, it wouldn't even need to come to this kind of a public campaign at all. Until we can achieve this, atheist awareness campaigns will remain necessarily provocative.
And, there's a difference between saying, we want you to think critically about your religion and we want you to think critically about what's going on and what your preacher is telling you, and threatening me with eternal damnation. There's a little bit of an imbalance there in what people see as offensive, which I think is really an interesting thing to discuss.
Another fair point, I think. Now, of course, when a Christian raves about Jesus as our Saviour at Christmas, he isn't trying to be offensive, but as I'll explain shortly, in doing so, he is implicitly condemning me and the people I know to hell, which doesn't exactly display the most jovial of Christmas spirit. At the very least, these banners are a somewhat more overt retaliation. We don't really have this kind of campaign in the UK, and if we did, it almost certainly wouldn't reach national news because nobody really cares. If America could adopt a similar attitude towards religious pluralism at Christmas, and that includes atheists who can often be real Debbie Downers during the holidays, I think we'd all have a lot more fun. You don't want banners? Some people don't want nativity scenes and religious carols. It's all or nothing. Welcome to America.
Dr. Frank, what do you think?
Well, the question is, what is true?
No, it's not. Frank seems to be confusing here the two strands of religious debate that I spend copious amounts of time trying to distinguish between. These are what I call the existential and political debates surrounding God. We're either talking about whether or not God exists, or we're talking about the moral and political implications of belief in God. Here, the argument is about how justified it is for atheists to put up these banners, not about whether the banners are actually true. Now granted, it's always important to discuss the truth in claims that are publicly made, but that's clearly not what the argument is about here specifically. As stated at the beginning of the segment, we're discussing whether or not atheists are, quote, evangelizing and whether or not this is justified, not whether or not God exists. I think what's happening here is a purposeful change of topic, but I won't concretely make that allegation, and I'll give Dr. Turek the benefit of the doubt here. Now, Frank goes on here to speak for a few minutes, detailing a cosmological argument and trying to convince us that God exists. The full video is in the description if you wish to see it, but I don't think that it's particularly relevant. Now, I'm not just trying to evade discussing his arguments, it's just an entirely different discussion that I've actually had many times before, and of course, I'll provide links to these too. So I think we'll skip forward to what I consider to be the main point.
Dr. Frank, I wanted to, are you offended by these billboards?
No, I'm from New Jersey. I'm not offended by anything. So it's just fine that they're doing this. It is bringing up a conversation. So I actually appreciate them saying, hey, let's talk about this. I know some people will be offended, but look, we live in America. We have free speech. You don't have a right not to be offended.
All right, so, but the idea that you're trying to get a conversation going, but are you more worried about someone telling you, Nick, that you're going to hell? And I mean, because he's not really telling you that at all, and he's actually just saying, hey, you know what, you have a right to do this, but, you know, he's giving you more facts and more information.
Well, sure, he's giving me more information. I don't know if he's giving me more facts or not. But, and even though Dr. Turek isn't threatening me with hell right now, I mean, that's the centerpiece of the religion. I mean, that's part of the game. You can't take the good with...
That was pretty crazy. That was bars. He's giving me more information, maybe not more facts. He's definitely giving you arguments. Something that Alex mentioned earlier in regards to the whole idea of, you know, Western countries becoming less and less religious, and the fact that, you know, countries like America and Great Britain, like these are nations where there's a significant number of non-believers. I had a conversation recently with Dr. Philip Schwadel, who's a sociologist, and he's done a number of surveys But in the General Social Survey in 1998, so we can kind of see how things have evolved. The U.S., 15% of people in the U.S. were non-religious, so they weren't affiliated with any sort of religion. And this has definitely evolved over time from that to, in 2021, 28%. And I think earlier in the 1970s, I didn't write it down, but earlier in the 1970s, it was as low as 9% of the U.S. population was non-religious. So clearly there's a trajectory that we're seeing of religion that's showing that more and more people are becoming non-religious, especially in Western cultures. Now, what's the consequence of that? Well, there's a lot of consequences of non-religion. Religious people, I don't know if you can see this, but religious people tend to be happier and healthier. American Sociological Association's 2012 Pew Research Center, and then the Pew Research Center's study in 2019, all sort of affirmed these different ideas. So in these surveys, they were asked, are you feeling down, depressed, or hopeless? Religious people said 40% yes, and 48% of non-religious people said yes to that question. That's just one survey question. Let's see what else. Little interest or pleasure in doing things. 36% of religious people said yes, whereas 45% of non-religious people said yes to that question. Feeling badly about yourself or that you are a failure. 36% of religious people said yes to that question, and 41% of non-religious people said yes to that question. This is also in terms of kind of more outward, rather than mental health, but also just kind of practices in terms of drinking, this is overall health. In terms of overall health, this is physical and mental health. The question was, yes or no, my overall health is very good or excellent. 57% of religious people said yes to that question, and only 47%, that's less than half of the population of non-religious people said that they felt they were overall happy and healthy, or in good, healthy sort of situation. So drug use is a lot higher in terms of non-religious people. Use of LSD, PCP, ecstasy is far higher. It's double in non-religious people versus religious people, with use of marijuana, use of cigarettes, being married. You're much likely to be married earlier in life if you're religious rather than for non-religious people. But in terms of, having sex, people who are non-religious have sex earlier than people who are religious. We also see that teen pregnancies and sort of these rough situations are far higher in people who are non-religious. So there's a lot of consequences for people who are non-religious, as we can see through several longitudinal studies. That I want to emphasize. These are longitudinal studies that expanded about decades of time. And so what's the conclusion that we can take from this? Well, the conclusion is one of two things. First, religion is good and we should all be religious. Or the second conclusion is maybe our society is not helping people who are non-religious. And when we look at societies where there's a lot more kind of social structures to accommodate for people who are non-religious, things like Western and Scandinavian countries in Europe, we're seeing that there is a much higher benefit, that the lives in terms of surveys of these people in places like Norway and Finland who are non-religious are about the same as people who are religious. And it's because there are social things in place, social institutions, social communities where people who are non-religious can actually join these communities. So the question becomes less so, can we make people more religious in order to help create a more useful, healthy society? And maybe the question is, okay, how can we actually accommodate our society, especially if you're here in the U.S.? How can we accommodate the U.S. society to match the rate of non-religion that we're seeing which is an increased degree of our population. About 29% from the 2021 population survey are people who are non-religious. So this is a significant amount of the population, definitely worth looking into. How can we help the well-being of these people? So it's definitely worth sort of getting the word out there and challenging people's perceptions so that people can be a little bit more accepting and a little bit more caring for people who are non-religious.
Without the
I
bad.
think that's part of the game. I really don't think that's part of what Christianity is all about.
I don't know that it's what it's all about.
And here we have it. This is my main issue with this viewpoint and with this discussion. I'd like to ask anybody who sympathizes with this view the following question. If Christianity is not about the faithful going to heaven and the faithless going to hell, then what exactly is it all about? I mean, really, can you think of an alternative contender? Let me elaborate. Jesus' death and resurrection is the single most important factor of Christianity. St. Paul wrote, in fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 14, that, quote, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith." So why is this so important? What's the significance of the resurrection that makes it so crucial? Well, the doctrine of Christianity states very plainly, Jesus died for our sins. The fall of man had condemned us to suffer eternal punishment at the hands of God and pay for our sins and Adam's. This was, anyway, until Jesus came along, became our scapegoat, took the punishment for us by dying on the cross so that we can now find salvation in heaven despite the sins of mankind. All we must do is place our faith in Jesus, and through his sacrifice, we can be saved. Find me the Christian who does not agree that this is the salient factor of their religion. And after you inevitably fail, consider what this means for those who do not accept the good news. If we must place our faith in Jesus so that we can escape eternal punishment, then what happens when I don't place my faith in Jesus? This is how we can justifiably say that the sending of non-believers to hell and the unthinkable punishment that people like myself and Mr. Fish are allegedly headed for is indeed what Christianity is all about. It's just a shame that under pressure from Fox News, Mr. Fish seems to have somewhat retracted his insistence on this point. Yes, condemning me to hell is a central core factor of Christianity, and though I'm not exactly quivering in my boots about it, I have to say that it's considerably disturbing that some individuals see this as something worthy of celebration and praise, and that implicitly teaching congregations of people that I'm a doomed sinner unworthy of salvation is at least as offensive as any billboard campaign that American atheists could dream up in 1,000 years.
I think that if you've never been really exposed to the real, understanding of the gospel, you don't get that message. And that's what I'm kind of like under.
So I think the difficult thing here is that people grow up in religion, right? And so when you grow up in a religious tradition, it almost becomes just like true. Like it just becomes like, yep, this is what's true. This is what's accepted, right? And so when someone sort of questions it and brings up this sort of speculation about it, this can be an issue for the person hearing it, right? When someone's saying, hell is a terrible doctrine, it's just absolutely terrible. There's so many issues, like eternal conscious punishment, really, for a finite crime here on earth. Like, I don't know, man. But when someone critiques that, the Christian or the person, hearing this is going to basically respond by saying, well, that's just true. That's just the truth of the reality. That's just what's happening. And so we need to make sure that people are saved. And so that's kind of what they're not able to kind of step back and look at hell from an outside perspective. They can only see it from the Christian perspective because they were conditioned that way from when they were a child. They grew up in this sort of society that propagated it. They grew up in a church. They grew up in maybe a group of people that taught them these things and people that they trusted. And that's what kind of led them down the road of believing hell is not only true, but it's also a good thing. And it's in accordance with the love of God. And it's kind of sounds crazy from an outward perspective, but it makes a lot of sense when we're talking about people who grew up in these faiths and all they know is this kind of way of thinking about things. And they can't really, it's hard for them to step out of that and look at it from an outward perspective. That's why I constantly emphasize on this channel, like, hear me out, okay? Consider what I'm saying and hear what I'm saying. And if you disagree with me, you disagree with me. That's fine. Like, I'm okay with you disagreeing with me, but at least give me the courtesy of stepping out of what your framework is. Try and step out of that. Set aside what you believe, your preconceived notions, and really just listen and hear. And I think if you do that to a lot of other people, you're going to build a lot of empathy. And I think it's going to build a society that's a lot more kind and charitable, whether you're a Christian or not. You know, I can learn from that. Like, I want to always be, you know, sort of setting aside my preconceived notions to be able to actually, you know, hear people out, consider what they're saying, not just what they're saying, but from the perspective that they're saying it from. Because I think that's just hugely, hugely important. Yeah, I got a comment. Riley, you're saying he's too right-winged and he caters too much to fundamentalists for me. I stopped watching him. Inspiring philosophy. Yeah. He is very, very much so right-winged. I think when I was a Christian, I really enjoyed just the fact that he was, you know, very, very good in terms of like sticking to facts and making sure that he had good scholarship and stuff. So I appreciate that aspect of it. The intellectual side that he brings, I think is solid. But I would agree, he is very much so quite right-winged. It's hard to get very many Christians who aren't conservative or right-winged. He also posts positions on abortion that he doesn't personally believe. I talked to him a couple times, and I think that's so hurtful. Interesting. I did not know that. So, wow. Yeah, I'd be curious as to, I mean, maybe I'll have to speak to him myself. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. It's tough when you propose something like that, and you know, a very controversial issue, and especially when you're that's the other thing. When you are a Christian YouTuber, you can't be wrong, and your Bible, your faith, it can't be wrong. Whereas if you're an atheist, it's okay to be wrong. You know, like, you assume that you're wrong. Like, more often than not, you assume that you're probably wrong. And I like the intellectual honesty. I also, you know, there's Christians out there who are, you know, more open-minded and things of that sort, and they aren't stuck to dogma. So I appreciate that for Christians out there who are like that. But yeah, that's the tough thing, is you can't be wrong if you're a Christian apologist on the internet. Otherwise, everyone unsubscribes from you. So it's kind of a sad reality, but yeah.
So here's an excruciating commonality. Hopefully you can see why my problem in this video is more with the moderator than it is with Frank Turek. I'm talking about the assumption that atheists don't understand the gospel. Look, detectives often have a better grasp of the nature of crime than a criminal. Music critics often have a deeper understanding of the theory and form behind a song than a singer does. And critics of religion often have a fuller understanding of scripture than the religious. Now, this isn't always the case, of course, but the assumption being made here just goes to show how easy it is for some to immediately write off the views of atheists just because they're not personally invested in a religion. Well, unless they take the threats of hell personally.
And I want to bring Dr. Frank in here because I think he can address that more. So, you know, Frank, why is it that Nick would feel as if Christianity is all about hell and damnation?
Well, I didn't say all about, just to be clear.
Just to be clear, but you're
not saying it's all about.
But the bulk of the message that you're getting from Christianity is that you're being condemned.
It's not the bulk, though, but it's.
But why would you bring that up if it's not the bulk?
Well, because it's so outrageous and it's so just beyond the pale to talk about eternal torture for finite sins,
okay,
right? That's the issue.
Okay, that was very quickly brushed over, but it's worth contemplating if you haven't done so before. The concept of eternal punishment for finite sins. Now, whether we apply the biblical principle of eye for eye, tooth for tooth or not, Maybe you think that there do exist crimes that do deserve a punishment that's more severe than the offence itself. But can you think of any crime whatsoever worthy of eternal punishment? That is, never-ending, infinite. Consider it this way. Now, I assume that most rational people would agree that any punishment should fit the offence committed. You can disagree with this if you wish, but the point would still stand. So let's just really oversimplify this for the sake of illustration and say something like a crime of severity level 1 deserves a punishment of 1 year in jail. A level 2 crime deserves 2 years, and so on. Now consider eternal punishment. In order to justify a magnitude of punishment that is infinite and eternal, what level of crime would be required? Well, of course, the crime would need to be infinite, which is impossible. The point I'm trying to make is that we can imagine an unthinkably horrendous crime, say a level 1000, the murder of your parents and family and the eating of their dead bodies. We might think that such an offence is deserving of an extreme punishment, as it surely is. But the punishment can never be justifiably infinite. Excessive? Sure. Long-lasting? Yes. Severe? Whatever. But eternal? Not a chance. No crime befits eternal punishment. No crime.
Nowhere in the Bible.
Yeah, so I would push back on that a little bit. I mean, I pretty much agree with that sentiment, and that's why I think eternal conscious punishment, eternal conscious torment is problematic in terms of a theological perspective of hell. Now, there's nuance here. There's other views of hell. There's the annihilationists, right? Someone who's going to say that eventually they will no longer exist. The souls of the people going to hell will no longer exist after a long period of time. Then there's the universalist who says, well, actually hell's more of this sort of refining fire, and that when you enter hell, it sort of refines you and it burns off all of the sin until you are then as pure, as white as snow, and then God can accept you into heaven. There's arguments that you can make, right, for both of those cases. And I think there's actually a large population of Christians who are annihilationists, and they can make a pretty compelling case. And there's some Christians who can make a fairly compelling case for universalism too. If I was a Christian, I'd probably, well, we mentioned inspiring philosophy. Something that he says is a hopeful universalist. That's probably what I would be too, is a hopeful universalist. But in terms of like what he's talking about, eternal conscious punishment, there is one refutation to that, which is something a lot of theologians bring up, which is this idea that when you're in hell, you don't just stop sinning, right? You don't stop sinning. And so sure, it's a eternal punishment, right? But it's eternal only because you continue to sin. And so the longer that you're there, the more sin you have to sort of atone for in hell. And so that's one sort of defense for eternal conscious punishment, because it doesn't really make sense logically if it's sort of this notion of a finite crime being eternally punished. And so, yeah, I mean, that's an explanation you can make. And I think it's probably the best one for eternal conscious punishment, but I don't know. And it is something to bring up, though. The atheists should bring this up. I think this is something we need to talk about because it's a big issue, and people only sort of like look past it and don't find it to be an issue. Like I said, because they were conditioned from childhood to think that this is just true. It's just a hard fact about reality. And so you don't really think to question it at all.
Does the Bible talk about torture? It talks about torment, which is self-inflicted.
Yes, self-inflicted by a person's inability to believe that a virgin bore a death-defying Son of God. Is this really the argument? It's not my fault that I'm unconvinced by the really rather lacking attempts to prove the truth of Christianity that theology currently offers. I've said it before, you don't choose what you believe. If you disagree with this, try for a moment to believe that Papua New Guinea doesn't exist. Try as you may, it's not a matter of choice. The torment of hell, which by the way is a synonym of torture and is defined as, quote, severe physical or mental suffering, is inflicted by an omniscient God, not by myself. I won't be blamed for utilizing the critical faculties that God himself knowingly bestowed me with. If he wants someone to chastise for my beliefs, he should take it up with a mirror.
Look, God won't force you into heaven against your will. If you don't want him now here, you're not going to want him in eternity.
I've heard this point made by Frank and others before, and it just seems to me to be such sophistry. In the vast majority of cases, atheists, who by and large are simply non-participants in any religious practice, don't dislike God, don't not want to be with God. They just simply don't believe in that God. I'd like to ask Mr. Churek whether his not being a Muslim is because he refuses Allah's kind offer of an afterlife, or because he just doesn't believe Allah to be the true God. Realize what you're saying. You're saying that if I'm unconvinced by shoddy evidence to support a particular supernatural claim, and again, remember, I don't choose what I believe, that it's justifiable to eternally punish me for it, because all it really is my not wanting to be with God in heaven. No, I hardly even consider whether or not I want to accept God's eschatological offerings, because I don't even so much as believe that they exist, which again is completely out of my control. How can you possibly justify punishing someone, and eternally too, for something that they can't control? It's despotic.
So God gives you a free choice. You can either be with God, that's heaven, or you can be separated from God, that's hell.
Ah, yes, choice. So God holds a shotgun to your head and says, "You'd better sacrifice your life to me, buddy, or I'll blow your face off. And don't forget to say thank you. After all, I am giving you the chance to have me not blow your face off, but I won't force you to accept that offer." Are you kidding me? He doesn't force us? If this isn't force, I don't know what is. Threatening somebody, saying, "You'll go to hell if you don't do as I say," is exactly analogous to holding a gun to someone's head and saying, "I'll shoot you if you don't do as I say."
This is exactly why I think we do need to sort of push back on some of these ideas. I like Jordan Peterson's kind of, I have critiqued Jordan Peterson in the past, and I think it's mostly because he likes to stay on the kind of conservative side for some reason, even though his theological bent is definitely more of that progressive side. But I like kind of his interpretation of scripture as sort of these archetypes and sort of these stories that deeply ingrain and help us understand and identify with the world. And so hell becomes this sort of natural consequence. And hell is not just this afterlife place, but it's also a place here and now that you can be in when you make decisions that are self-destructive, that are not going to propagate yourself and help you to continue. In the analogy of the mice, like continue the game, continue the repetition, right? And so that's the sort of idea that I think is useful, and we can use terms like hell to refer to these concepts of like hell here on earth and personal torment that you bring upon yourself. We can learn from these things. We can grow from these things. We aren't stuck to them, like the notion of hell as eternal conscious punishment seems to suggest. We're not stuck with that, but instead it's this idea of learning and growing and becoming more through time.
Of course, you have the choice to not submit to the gunman and have your head blown off, but this is still force, and it's still unthinkably unethical, definitively tyrannical, and the essence of Christianity.
Now, the beauty of Christianity and the beauty of Christmas is that God literally put human flesh over his deity to come and save us from that, so we don't have to go and be separated from him. And all you need to do is trust in him, because what he's done on the cross is save me and save you from our sins if we want it. But if you don't want it, that's fine. God will leave you alone in eternity. That's what hell is.
I don't much appreciate these euphemisms for hell. I mean, separation from God. Sure, that might be one characteristic of hell, but I think you're forgetting about the torment and the fire and the suffering and the choking, which I think are all pretty important considerations when making a choice about whether or not to go there. It's not like, here, have this nice thing.
I mean, that's not like super clear from scripture that that's the case, that there's the lake of fire, and there's different explanations of the punishment, but most of our depictions of what we think of as hell are actually just depictions from the Middle Ages. It's not actually from the Bible. Like demons and the devil like whipping us, like that's not in the Bible. hell is not really talked about a lot. There isn't a lot of like deeply discussed ideas around hell, or straight up descriptions of what hell as a actual entity or an actual place is going to be like. Fire is brought up a lot, weeping and gnashing of teeth. If you define that as hell, then that's a description of it. But yeah, it's not overall super clear exactly what hell is, which is why there's other views of hell outside of eternal conscious torment that are seriously considered in theology. They're serious positions for Orthodox Christians to consider. And, if I was an Orthodox Christian, I would definitely consider those ones over eternal conscious torment.
Or don't, it's your choice. It's like, here, have this thing that you probably don't want anyway, but if you don't take it, then you'll suffer and burn for it. But I mean, it's your choice. I consider this to be a bit of a con, and I only wish that Christians were more willing to recognize that this absurd proposition is literally the basis of their faith. But anyway, I suppose the main takeaway from this, if you ask me, is yes, okay, the billboards are kind of offensive, but they sort of have to be, and honestly, Christianity as a faith is far more offensive to atheists anyway, so let's just call it quits for now, respect the First Amendment, and keep up the lively discussion over the holiday season. Or in other words, just shut up and enjoy the turkey, or whatever vegans eat at Christmas. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can follow me on social media here. Do come to the event next week if you'll be in Croatia. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Shut up and enjoy the turkey. I love it. I actually really enjoyed that video. I love the pushback that he gave. Yeah, no, definitely a pretty solid one there. All right. Comment time. Comment below. Honestly, I really just enjoyed that video. I think it's probably one of the better ones he's that I've seen so far from him. I enjoy his Within Reason podcast, I think, a little bit more because it's less so this sort of like pushback against Christianity. I'm just not a huge fan of that. I like to just kind of have actual like kind of nuanced conversations, but this is kind of what his channel was about at the beginning of it. He was very much so about pushing back against Christianity, and I think this was a pretty good, pretty fair critique of hell and defending the national atheism. So, yeah, what shall we comment? There was something along the lines of, what was it? I don't remember. Probably, let me think. What are your guys' thoughts? What should we comment? Probably something along the lines of, I'm thinking something along the lines of the descriptions of different types of hell and how this emphasized the critique of eternal conscious torment, but there's a lot more nuance to the topic. So I'm thinking of probably commenting something along those lines. I remember not too long ago, I was in a Bible study too, and they were talking about hell at one point in the Bible study. We were reading through Revelation, and pretty well everyone there was kind kind of a Christian, and they kind of believed in the notion of hell, of eternal conscious torment. And I brought up in Revelation 21 where it talks about the second death, right? That they will enter the lake of fire and they will achieve their second death. How a lot of people point to that and say, well, that's evidence of annihilationists. And so I kind of brought it up, and I remember when I brought it up, there was a few kind of faces that were like, oh, interesting. And they found it to be maybe a little bit more kind of a notion. So I don't know what their thoughts exactly were, but I was kind of hoping I could, turn them in the direction of maybe believing that instead. Because it's definitely a hard pill to swallow, for sure. Definitely a tough thing. Yep. So I said, this was a great video. I think eternal conscious torment is a tough pill to swallow for the Christian. I would love to hear your thoughts regarding annihilationism or universalism. Might these be backed up by scripture and more in line with God's desire for all to be saved? Again, putting the human back in, the humanity back in faith. That's the theme. That's the theme of today's video. Let's put the humanity back in religion. All right. Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sticking around through this video. It has been a lot of fun. If you are unfamiliar with this channel at all, my name is Jackson of Truth and Tradition. I run a podcast interviewing scholars on the intersection of science, religion, and philosophy. And so if that's your thing, come and join us. Come and join us. I live stream every Tuesday night, 7:30 p.m. Central Standard Time until about 9:30 p.m. Central Standard Time, discussing and watching these videos. So if this is your jam, if you like Alex O'Connor, or if you just like talking about philosophy, science, and religion, this is your place. So appreciate you all. It has been super real. Thank you for being here, and I wish you all the best as you carry on into the rest of your week.